The events you're about to see are based on real accounts. To protect the identities of those involved, names and details have been changed. My name is Daniel Miller, and I live in Connecticut with my wife Leah. We've been living in this house for almost 3 years now, but the things that happened to us during the first few months are still fresh in my mind. I was never someone who believed in paranormal stuff, ghosts or curses. I always thought it was just superstition or people looking for something to believe in. But I'm not sure what I believe anymore after what we went through. The house we bought was old, not ancient, but old enough to have a history. It was built in the 1930s, a 2-story house that had clearly been well maintained. It had character, creaky floors, wooden beams that made the house feel alive in its own way. When we moved in, the previous owners had already left most of their things behind. They were an older couple who had moved to a retirement community. Most of the furniture was gone, but there were a few boxes of old stuff that we found in the attic, which included vintage toys, old books, and random knickknacks. One item caught my attention. It was a Raggedy Ann doll, old and worn, with a crooked smile and patchwork clothes. It had this unsettling look about it, like it was staring right at me, even though its eyes were made of simple buttons. I remember laughing at how creepy it was, but Leah thought it was charming and wanted to keep it. I didn't mind it much at first, but something about the doll always made me feel uneasy. We placed it on a shelf in the living room, right near the window, as a quirky decoration. That's when the weird things started happening. At first, they were small things, easy to brush off as coincidence. The doll would move slightly. I'd come into the room, and it would be facing a different direction. I told myself it was just the air conditioning making it shift. Maybe it was because the house was old, and the floorboards weren't entirely even. But the more it happened, the less I was able to explain it away. Leah didn't seem to mind, but I could see the way her eyes would dart to the doll whenever she passed by it. I don't think she fully realized how unsettling it was until later. One night, I came home from work late and the doll was gone. I looked everywhere for it. The living room, the kitchen, even under the furniture. It wasn't there. I remember feeling a coldness settle in my chest. It wasn't like I was scared of the doll, but something just felt wrong. I figured Leah had moved it, but when I asked her, she looked just as confused as I was. We checked every room in the house, but the doll was nowhere to be found. We went to bed that night, both of us feeling on edge. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a soft creaking coming from downstairs. I tried to ignore it, but the creaking was followed by faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking through the living room. My heart began to race, and I felt my entire body freeze. Leah was still asleep beside me, unaware of what was happening. I waited, the sound growing louder until I could no longer ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously crept downstairs. The living room was dark, but the faint glow of moonlight came through the windows. That's when I saw it. The doll. It was sitting upright on the couch, staring at me with those unblinking button eyes. I could barely breathe. I don't know how it got there, but it was impossible to ignore. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't feel like a simple prank or some odd occurrence. It felt like something far worse. I picked it up, my hand trembling, and decided to put it away in the attic. Leah and I hadn't spoken much about the doll, but I knew she didn't want it in the house anymore. I thought it would end there. I put the doll back in the box and locked the attic door. But the very next morning, when I went up to grab something from the attic, I found the box open. The doll sitting in the middle of the floor, facing the stairs as though it was waiting for me. That was when things started to escalate. The doll wasn't the only thing moving anymore. We started finding things out of place around the house. Doors would be open that we had left shut. Windows would be unlatched. The kitchen faucet would be on when we knew we had turned it off. And the worst part? Notes. They started appearing, scattered across the house like someone had been leaving them there for us to find. The first note was on the kitchen counter, folded neatly in half. It was written in uneven, childlike handwriting, almost like a scribble, but the message was clear. Help me. Leah and I stared at it, unsure of what to make of it. We both thought it could be a prank, but no one knew we were even having these strange occurrences yet, and no one had been in the house besides us. A few days later, another note appeared on our living room coffee table. "Why did you leave me?" This one sent a chill down my spine. Leah was visibly shaken, but I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably a prank or just our minds playing tricks. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Things went from strange to terrifying when I found the next note. It was on the mirror in the bathroom, smeared as if it had been written with something wet. It said, "I'm upstairs. Come find me." I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to find out what was waiting for me. But the thought of the doll and the messages kept gnawing at my mind. I didn't know what else to do. That night, Leah begged me to get rid of the doll once and for all. She couldn't stand it anymore, and neither could I. We decided to burn it. I figured if I burned it, it would be over. I took it to the fireplace and set it down, ready to watch it turn to ash. The fire was strong, but the doll refused to burn. The flames flickered around it, but the fabric didn't catch fire. It began to smell, a foul stench of something rotting, like burnt hair and rubber. The air grew thick with something I couldn't explain, and I had to put the fire out. We couldn't explain what was happening. The doll was still in the house, and things were getting worse. I didn't want to think about it, but I had to do something. That's when we contacted a paranormal investigator, someone I thought was crazy but was desperate enough to try anything. The investigator, a man named Richard, came the following day. He didn't speak much at first, just walked around the house with a strange device, taking readings. Then when he saw the doll, he grew silent, his face pale. He told us it was bad, that this wasn't just a haunted object, but something far more sinister. The doll was a vessel for an entity, something dark, and he warned us that it was feeding off our fear. He told us to get rid of it and never look back. Richard performed a ritual, one I couldn't fully understand, but it was enough to make the air feel lighter, almost like the house had been holding its breath. He told us the spirit would move on, that we could finally be at peace. But after he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. Every time I turned around, it felt like someone was there, just out of sight. A few weeks passed with no more strange occurrences. The house felt calm again, but I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't ignore the unease that had settled deep within me. And then, one night, I heard it again. The faint footsteps, dragging across the floor. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was still in this house, but I had to know. I opened the door to the attic where everything had started and found the box. The doll was gone. I searched the attic, but it was nowhere to be found. My heart raced as I heard Leah calling from downstairs. The house felt alive again in a way I couldn't explain. I don't know what happened to that doll, but I don't think we'll ever be free of it. My name is Darren McCauley. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What I'm about to tell you happened 14 years ago, but even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the fear and anxiety of that day. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or supernatural things, but what I experienced in a hotel in Texas was something I just can't explain, and honestly, it haunts me to this day. In 2010, I had to make an unexpected business trip to Galveston, Texas. Instead of staying in a random hotel, I decided to look for something more interesting, maybe more cozy, since I was tired of impersonal, soulless hotels. That's when I found the Hotel Galvez, a historic place known for its old architecture. The place reeked of history, with dark wooden furniture, carpets that seemed to have been woven centuries ago, and an old smell that lingered in the air. The hotel had a kind of haunted vibe, with old paintings on the walls and a heavy silence that seemed to be everywhere. The hallway was narrow, and the dim lights barely illuminated the walls, giving the place a claustrophobic feel. When I passed the third door, I noticed a painting that stood out among the others. It was a portrait of a man with such an intense gaze that I almost stopped to look at it longer. The painting was of a Spanish general, wearing an old-fashioned uniform, his eyes piercing through the canvas. I paused for a moment, trying to rationalize the feeling I had, but my mind was already starting to wonder if the sensation of being watched was just my imagination. I resisted the urge to turn around and went to my room. The lamp on the nightstand flickered slightly, but I was tired and decided to sleep. That was my mistake. The hotel felt too quiet, as though the sound was absorbed by the wood and the old carpets. It was when I tried to sleep that I started hearing a very faint whisper. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, convincing myself it was just the wind or the creaking of the building. But as time passed, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. It was a feeling of being watched, of not being alone in the room. I lifted my head to look around, but there was nothing there. The silence was oppressive. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind, but for some reason, I started feeling like I was no longer in control of the situation. The whisper, which seemed to come from everywhere, became clearer. I got up and opened the door to my room. The hallway was empty, just like before, but something was different. The air felt colder than before. I looked at the third door I had passed, and the painting again. Bernardo de Galvez. His eyes seemed more piercing than before, as if he was really looking at me. The feeling was unbearable. I didn't know why, but I felt like he was watching me accusingly, as if he knew what I was thinking. When I passed by the door again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I ran back to the room, my heart racing. The feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I shut the door and locked it, but the fear wouldn't subside. The whisper continued, now louder, almost as though it was coming from the painting itself. Loves, Loves. I got up and tried to go to the bathroom, but what I saw on the wall made me freeze. The reflection of the painting in the mirror was no longer at the angle it should have been. It looked as if it had moved while I wasn't looking. I was paralyzed. I knew it didn't make sense, but somehow I felt that the painting was more than just an old piece of art. I needed to leave. Then came the strangest sound. It was like something was tapping on the door with a soft insistence. I froze. There was no one there, yet I heard the knocks. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks again. I could feel the weight of the silence as it happened. The knocks were followed by a very clear whisper, one that seemed to come from the room itself, not from the hallway. Loves, Verdad? Panic overtook me. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran to the door and unlocked it without hesitation. When I opened it, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the cold in the air was unbearable, and the whisper echoed around me. I looked back at the painting, and this time, it seemed even closer. The general's gaze was fixed on me, and I felt as though something was watching me. I had to get out of there. I raced down the stairs in panic, not caring about what was going on. When I reached the front desk, the receptionist was there, almost as though she was waiting for something. I was trembling, and when she looked me in the eye, she said, "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't know how to respond, but something told me she knew exactly what I had just gone through. She offered me a room on the lower floor, but I no longer wanted to stay in that hotel. I accepted the offer, but I felt the shadow of what had just happened still following me. When I got to the new room, the feeling of being watched never left me, and that night was marked by the anguish of not being able to sleep, of not being able to relax. The next day, before leaving Galveston, I asked about the portrait of the general. The receptionist told me that the portrait of Bernardo de Galvez had been left by the hotel's former owners, and that many people had had the same experience. Eyes that followed, whispers in Spanish, and in some cases, intense cold around the painting. I was stunned. I didn't know if it made any sense, but one thing was certain. I would never go back to Galveston. I would never stay in a historic hotel again. What happened there, however, still lingers with me, and every now and then, in an absolute silence, I hear the whisper, "Loves." My name is Mitchell Hargrove, and I've lived in Baton Rouge for the past 42 years. I'm a practical man, a man who believes in logic, in the tangible. I have no room for superstition in my life, but what happened to me, what I saw, still haunts me to this very day. I've never been the same since that night, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes I can still feel the weight of that mirror on me, watching, waiting. It was a sunny spring day when my wife, Claire, and I bought our first house. It was an old plantation-style mansion, the kind that seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. The kind of place you would imagine filled with secrets. Secrets that might be better left undisturbed. But at the time, all we cared about was the price. It was a steal. We were young, eager to start our life, and the thought of restoring this grand old house to its former glory seemed like the perfect project. But what we didn't know, what no one had dared to tell us, was that the house came with a dark history. As soon as we set foot in the house, I felt something was off, but I couldn't place it. It was an uncanny feeling, like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to notice it. But I shook it off. After all, this was supposed to be a fresh start for us. We didn't have time for irrational thoughts. We started moving in, unpacking, trying to get settled. The first thing that caught my attention was the mirror. It was an enormous antique mirror, the kind you would expect to see in a grand ballroom or a rich person's parlor. Its frame was dark and intricately carved, with strange symbols that I couldn't make sense of, like they had been etched into the wood with some kind of reverence. But it wasn't the carvings that disturbed me. It was the way it made me feel when I looked at it. There was something about the way it reflected the room. It wasn't just a reflection, it felt alive, like it was staring back at me, observing me, waiting for me to make a move. I told myself I was being paranoid, but it was hard to ignore the prickling sensation creeping down my spine every time I walked past it. Claire didn't seem to notice. She was busy with other things, and I didn't want to worry her. I made a mental note to get rid of it eventually, but life got in the way. Days passed, and we went about our routines, but there was always this presence in the house. It was subtle at first, just the occasional creak of the floorboards when no one was around, or the way the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms. But it wasn't long before things started to get worse. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. Claire was upstairs taking a bath, and the house was still. As I sat there, I started to hear a faint scratching sound coming from the living room. I dismissed it as the house settling. But then it happened again. A louder scrape this time. It was coming from the direction of the mirror. I turned off the TV, trying to listen more carefully. The sound came again, sharp, deliberate. I stood up and walked towards the mirror, my heart starting to beat faster, my pulse quickening with an inexplicable sense of dread. The air around me felt heavier, like the very atmosphere had thickened. As I approached the mirror, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, a trick of the light, but then I realized that something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror didn't match what was in the room. The lighting was wrong, the shadows stretched unnaturally, and in the far corner, barely visible in the reflection, were the faint outlines of two small figures, like children standing just outside of the frame. I stepped back in shock, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned to look behind me. There was nothing there. Just an empty room. But when I looked back at the mirror, the children were gone. The reflection was normal again, just the room as it should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe I'd imagined it. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified. I could feel the weight of the mirror bearing down on me, pressing into my skin. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a doorway. An entrance to something I couldn't understand. Later that night, I told Claire what happened, but she wasn't as concerned as I was. She laughed it off, calling it a figment of my imagination, a side effect of the stress of moving into a new house. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that mirror was aware of me. It was watching, waiting. Over the next few days, things started to escalate. I began to notice strange marks on the mirror. At first, it was just a few faint smudges, but then the marks started to get clearer. Handprints, small, child-sized handprints smudged into the glass. They were always there, no matter how many times I cleaned the mirror. The glass itself seemed to resist cleaning, the marks reappearing almost immediately after I wiped them away. I could feel my sanity slipping. I tried to tell Claire, but she just dismissed it as dust or condensation, something easily explained. But it wasn't just dust. One night after Claire had gone to bed, I stayed up late, staring at the mirror. I don't know why. I couldn't help myself. There was something magnetic about it, something pulling me toward it, like I had no control over my own actions. As I gazed into the glass, I saw them again. The children. This time I could see them clearly. They were standing in the reflection, their small faces pale and distorted, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me from the other side. I froze, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection. The room behind me seemed to warp and twist, the shadows growing longer, more sinister. And then, as if they had been waiting for me to notice, the children moved. Slowly at first, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Their hands pressed against the glass, leaving deeper, more pronounced marks as they tried to reach out to touch me. I could feel their cold presence pressing against me, like they were just on the other side of the mirror, trying to break through. I stumbled back, my heart racing, gasping for air. I turned away from the mirror, but I could still feel their presence, their eyes burning into me. I ran upstairs to Claire, my body trembling, my mind reeling. She was awake when I burst into the room, her eyes wide with alarm. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't find the words. I just pointed to the mirror downstairs. She stared at me, confused, but then something in my expression must have told her that I wasn't joking. "I'll go with you," she said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. We descended the stairs together, and as we walked into the living room, I felt it. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When we reached the mirror, I couldn't look at it directly. I could feel it, though. It was there, like a presence lurking just out of sight, just behind the glass. We stood in silence for a long time, and then Claire finally spoke. "There's nothing here, Mitchell. It's just a mirror." But I could see it now, even in the dim light. The reflection was wrong. The room behind me wasn't the living room I knew. It was darker, colder, the walls stained with shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, in the reflection, I saw them. The children. They were there, staring back at us with hollow eyes, their small hands pressed against the glass. But now, there was something else. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing behind them. It was blurry, its features indistinct, but I could feel its presence. It was staring at me. The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, white and foggy in the air. Claire shuddered beside me, and for the first time I could tell she was starting to feel it too. But it was too late. The children moved, their hands pressed harder against the glass, and the tall figure behind them took a step forward. It was as if it was trying to break free, to step out of the mirror and into the room. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, and I grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her away from the mirror. We ran out of the house that night and we never returned. The house was abandoned after that. The mirror, I'm sure, is still there waiting for its next victim. And as for me, I'll never be the same. I know what's out there, behind the glass. I know what's waiting for someone foolish enough to look. I'm telling you now so that you don't make the same mistake I did. If you ever find a mirror like that, don't look. Don't ever look. My name is Ethan Turner, and I'm 39 years old. I live in Orlando, Florida, and I've been living with something haunting me for the last few years. What happened to me in Key West changed me, changed the way I see the world. It wasn't just a creepy doll or some unexplainable incident. No, it was a warning. A warning I didn't fully understand until it was too late. What I'm about to tell you might sound unbelievable, but I swear to you, every word of it is true. I wish I could forget what happened, but every time I close my eyes, I feel it lurking, waiting to come back. It started when my wife, Sarah, and I decided to take a quick getaway to Key West. We both needed a break, and I'd heard about the East Martello Museum and the infamous Robert the Doll. I'd seen the photos online and thought it was just another tourist trap, a doll locked up in a glass case with some eerie stories attached to it. I didn't expect much, but I figured, why not? It'd be something to talk about. We arrived at the museum early, just as it was opening. The air was thick with humidity and the sun was already beating down, but the building itself felt cold. Almost too cold, especially inside. The museum was dimly lit, with high ceilings and old, dusty displays. I didn't think much of it. The moment we stepped into the room where Robert the Doll was kept, though, I felt the atmosphere shift. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something deeper. something oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. And Robert, God, that doll, he was staring at me, his button eyes gleaming in the dim light. The room was small, with glass cases surrounding the exhibit. But Robert, he wasn't in a simple case like the other items. No, he was placed inside a box that was almost too big for him, as if the museum was trying to keep him contained, almost like they were afraid he would escape. His small, ragged body was dressed in a sailor suit, and his face was unsettling. His lips were frozen in a weird, unblinking smile, and his eyes, they seemed to follow you. They seemed to track your every movement. I'm not someone who usually gets creeped out by things like this, but something about him made me uneasy. My wife, Sarah, didn't want to get too close. She said she felt an unsettling presence, like something was watching us. I dismissed it at the time. I thought she was just being overly dramatic. But I can't say that anymore. I walked up to the glass, took out my phone, and snapped a picture. Nothing happened at first, but as I looked at the screen, I felt a strange chill run through me. I checked the photo, and the doll's eyes, they were no longer where they should have been. They were looking straight at the camera. The smile was bigger too, almost as if it had grown wider. I'm telling you, I could feel something shift in that moment, like the air had gotten thicker around me. Sarah saw the look on my face and pulled me away. "Come on, Ethan, let's go," she said. "I don't like this place." But I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about Robert, about that damn smile. It was like he had been waiting for me to look at him. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But when we left the museum and got back to the hotel, something wasn't right. The atmosphere around me felt off, like I was being followed, like there was something lurking just out of sight. Later that night, as we were relaxing in our room, Sarah went to bed early. I stayed up, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. But then something strange happened. My phone flickered and the screen went black. I thought it was a glitch, but then I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible sound, like a laugh. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone in the room. The laugh seemed to come from my phone. My heart skipped a beat. I turned it on, and there was the photo of Robert again. But now it was different. The doll's eyes were fully open, and his smile had grown wider, more menacing. I froze. How was this possible? How could it have changed like that? I tried to delete the image, but my phone wouldn't let me. It was like the photo was locked, as if it had a life of its own. I started to panic. I tried everything to get rid of the image, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't go away. My hands were shaking, and I felt my stomach turn with fear. Suddenly, the air conditioner turned off. I checked the controls, but everything was fine. It had just stopped working. The room grew hot and stuffy, and I felt a suffocating pressure around me. My breathing became shallow, and the laughter, it kept coming, faint but unmistakable. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to understand what was happening. My mind was racing, but no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't. It was like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I reached over to Sarah, shaking her awake. "Sarah, wake up! Something's wrong," I said, my voice trembling. She groggily looked at me, but before I could say anything else, I heard the laugh again, this time louder. It wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from somewhere else in the room. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up and walked to the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. My skin crawled and I turned around expecting to see Sarah, but she was still lying in bed, her face turned away from me. No, it wasn't her. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, this presence, this thing watching me. I ran out of the room, leaving Sarah behind. I didn't care about anything at that moment. I just needed to get away from whatever was in that hotel room. I ran to the lobby, my heart still racing. I tried to talk to the receptionist, but when I turned to look back, the entire building seemed darker, more oppressive. The walls felt like they were pressing in, and I could still hear that laugh echoing through the halls. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't get the courage to go back upstairs. It was like the place had its claws in me, keeping me trapped. When Sarah finally found me in the lobby, she was furious, but she could see something was wrong. I tried to explain what had happened, but I don't think she understood. She was worried about me, but I couldn't get the words out. The doll, Robert, had somehow followed us. And now it wasn't just the doll. It was everything. The air, the walls, the very building itself seemed alive, and it was closing in on me. We left the hotel as soon as possible, but the effects lingered. It wasn't over. It wasn't just a bad experience. Something had changed, something had followed me. My phone continued to act up, the screen flickering, photos changing without explanation. But it wasn't just the phone. I began to see things, shadows moving in my peripheral vision, whispers when I was alone. And every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that laugh. The laugh of Robert the doll. I don't know what it was that followed me. I don't know if it was Robert himself or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. It's not over. Every night I hear the laugh. I feel the presence. It's in my house now. It's everywhere. If you're ever in Key West and you think about visiting that museum, don't. Don't take a picture. Don't even look at that damn doll. Because once you do, you might not be able to escape. And if you start hearing that laugh, if your phone starts acting strange, don't try to understand it. Just get out. Get out before it's too late. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like to support the community. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. See you next time.